Look at all these fun people.
Hi, Matt Kelly. Nice to see you.
Hey, Jess.
It's nice to see everyone, obviously, but I haven't seen you in longest.
Hi, Rico. It's been so long since I've seen you.
Now it doesn't have to be.
Who else coming today? Should we give folks maybe a couple more minutes? I know that Dawn's going to be late.
Yeah, and Ray just left here at 4:30, and he's got at least a half an hour of transit, so he's probably going to be screaming in around 5:15. And so, Michelle, yeah, I don't know. I personally, I'd vote to just kick off because we only get half an hour, and then people can join if they join.
Okay, that's cool with me. I feel a little bit fluttered having never hosted a roundtable before, much less on Data Together, and much less on a topic which I feel is not terribly clearly defined. But I think hopefully we'll have some interesting conversations and to-dos. So should we start with intros? Does everybody know everybody on the call? Just I don't see who. Is that Dawn? Maybe. No, it's PatCon. Maybe we should do some quick intros then. In the first 5 minutes. I'm Jess. I'm a PhD student studying web archiving at the University of Southampton, working with Edgy. So yeah, say your name, where you're located, and maybe, what project or partnership you're coming from. And I see Kevin first.
Hey everyone, I'm Kevin. I'm calling from San Diego. I do front-end dev on the web monitoring project.
We could just like pass the baton.
Oh, okay, I see Rob next.
Howdy, I'm Rob, or Mr. Ogorog, MR0GROG on Slack, and I'm somewhere centrally on the West Coast, mostly working on web monitoring things, but I try and pop in on Data Together stuff when I can. So I'll pass it to Matt.
I haven't tested my audio yet. Can you hear me? Okay, I'm Matt Kelly. I'm a PhD student at Old Dominion in Virginia, and I've been on calls before trying to help out where I can, help and B5 out some, but yeah, I'm here just generally to help.
I'll go. I'm Patrick or PatCon. I'm based in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, Earth. And I'm a member of the civic tech community in the city. I feel like that's my prime affiliation. I want to contribute more with onboarding because there's a lot of overlap with the needs of the community, physical community at my city. But yeah, I feel like I need to step up, do more. That's me. Brennan next.
Hey, what's up? I'm Brendan, aka B5. I work at Query and Edgy and Data Together, if those are all things. Yeah, and I think most of you know me. I know all of you, but yeah, whatever. Cool. I can call out Michelle next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Browse. I'm an employee of Protocol Labs. I'm doing some work with the IPFS team and our sort of relationship and product work with Data Together. I'm new to the roundtable call, but I'm excited. And I typically am in San Francisco, but right now, for today, I'm in New York.
I think that leaves just
Did we get everyone, or?
I can go. I am Rico Gardafe. I work at Query with Brendan, and I'm an otherwise hench person when it comes to Data Together and some of our work with Edgy.
Cool, thanks everybody. And Brandon, is that right? So we'll awesome. Does everybody have the notes in front of them? I'll just pop them in the Zoom, assuming that's the right Google Doc. Yeah. For those who hear for how this roundtable got proposed, not that there's really much background to it. It was, I think, the March 19th call, so it's been a few weeks since we actually talked about this, but it just kind of came up in conversation about sort of thinking through, what maybe some of the, if Data Together as a community or a collective of communities wants to think about the kinds of data that might be held in Data Together, and if there's some distinction between what we're talking about when we talk about web archives versus data sets. So that's like a really huge, very broad, ill-defined question in my mind. It's something I've given a lot of thought to in terms of how we define what a web archive is, because it's one of the, hi Mike, it's kind of one of the topics of my PhD. So I have thoughts on that, but that's not really like a 30-minute roundtable. But I guess really, I think some of the big questions, Ray's here now too. Hi Ray. Wow, this is like a really big call. Ray put in some initial thoughts in terms of like some quick questions that we might get the ball rolling. And I threw in some more long-winded thoughts on the GitHub issue. But yeah, I mean, I think it just centers around sort of how we want to think about really generally whether or not we want to have a philosophical conversation here or whether or not we want to talk about kind of the specifics, technical challenges between different kinds of data types. I don't really know. And I'm open for suggestions on how folks want to like lean the call towards. Hopefully we'd like to kind of get to a place where we can have some to-dos to have further conversations. Yeah, so Ray threw out some questions. So, what do we want to or will we archive? And then threw out some kind of file extensions. Are we just interested in archiving stuff from the web? Are we interested in helping people archive things that weren't born on the web? That's another kind of more philosophical question. And are there different kind of challenges in there? But I might just open the floor up, because I think I have really abstract ideas, and it might be good to kind of steer us based on what folks want to talk about, if that helps at all. Anyone?
I have so many thoughts on this, but I don't want to trample on his face. Somebody else should talk.
I knew you did. I was kind of looking at you, Brendan. But
all right, so yeah, I'm going to go, but let's not talk about this for too long. But to me, the key distinction, one of the big distinctions is I like to think about this as a spectrum of how structured the information is, not so much as is this a web archive versus a data set. And to me, that's a really interesting and exciting continuum, because on one end you have assuming everything's digital, you have one end which is like completely unstructured information, which is just effectively like a giant array of bytes. So it's just like if you were to open up a text editor and mash a bunch of information into a text file and hit save, that's about as unstructured as it can get. And on the other end, you have like the most structured data you can get, which theoretically is like an SQL database, where like everything in there is like, you can't even put like if it goes in this column, it's a number, and if you try to put something in that isn't a number, then it doesn't work. And so to me, the question of like, are we archiving data sets or are we archiving web pages is I try to contextualize that with how structured is the information. And what I think is most interesting is we get that conversation about the semantic web or the current web kind of arising out of that. We often sort of have this question of we'd like the internet to be more machine readable, more semantically aware, which to me is a gesture to try and add additional structure to the way that HTML works as it currently stands. But obviously, the internet is built on these layers of things, or the web is built on these layers of things that sort of accumulated over time. And HTML as it stands is completely parsable by browsers, but we don't have any sort of semantic introspection into that information. So I don't know. I see web archives as potential really cool data sets, but I don't want. I want to sort of start that with this like structure conversation. I'll leave that.
Yeah, PatCon.
Yeah, I do wonder whether there's like I have lots of thoughts on what structured data is and what it should be and what the best. I do wonder whether if data together function more as like, not necessarily structures first or organization first, but like new ways of connecting, like allowing people to subscribe or follow data and receive updates, or allowing like almost in a way that you can mention people into GitHub issues. You could mention or bring people who are interested in the data into it. You could steward it together. You could watch it. Basically, like I feel like all the much of the structure conversation will fall out of it being in front of people more often and more monitorable and adoptable. And I wonder whether there's a community first and supporting like the ways people could watch it, and that whether the structure choices will come out of that after. But I don't know. That's not fully thought out, and I haven't spent as much time thinking about this.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Pat. Does anyone else have immediate thoughts? I'm you off the back of that, but I want to take. So I have two thoughts. One is that when you start talking about kind of the semantic web, my social science brain, like, although I understand what the semantic web is, like immediately starts shutting down. And it's something and I only mention this not because like I hate the semantic web or the idea of the semantic web, but because I put it in the issue. I think there's an issue around language here in terms of inclusivity and exclusivity and who's part of this community and how is the kind of language that we use kind of create those kind of thoroughfares for people to come in and do what they want. But sorry, PatCon, did you have an immediate thought on that?
I was just getting on Stack. I'll wait.
Okay, sorry. And so, yeah, anyway, so I'm thinking about language and thinking about terminology and thinking about the way that kind of creates our community, but also thinking about use. And I imagine that's kind of what you're thinking about, Brendan, in terms of like structured is like, what can we do with structured data? Or in my mind anyway, the more structured data is, like, it kind of defines the kinds of things you can do with that data. And I guess ultimately we're also talking about like how we want to structure the community in a way. So I feel like the more structure we put into place and the kinds of things we deem to be data, the more kind of almost endangered, I guess there are kind of risks that might come with that sort of pigeonholing what this is about and kind of particular path dependencies going forward. But those are just my random thoughts in response to your thoughts, Brendan. So yeah, I'll pass the baton now.
I think that's so good. And I think someone else should take that and run with it. Pat, you're on Stack, right?
Yeah, I'm just I don't know if it fits. I missed the last roundup or round table. So, but I guess in thinking about the sort of data, the sort of formats to exist on this, I wonder if those are like to be discovered through communications and processes that like we lure people. That I don't know. Like, I wonder like, could this be a space for not like there are processes that are really like arcane and deep in the internet infrastructure, like IETF processes for defining specs and coming to them. And I wonder, pull people like, oh, hey, this data relates to you and you and you, and you have all this insight on it, and pulling into a common, community or conversation, like, and maybe support tools for helping those people bang out specs that like, maybe that is, so the format, again, like that sort of way of the formatting, not the formats not being as important as pulling people together, and that formats could be figured out. I don't know if I'm thinking around in the right lines though.
Yeah, Rob.
I guess I was staying quiet because I'm having trouble articulating this for myself, but I think I would start with Brendan kind of talked about structured versus unstructured in terms of like lots of bytes that we don't know what they are. And I think the way I think about it when you pose this question about data sets is very maybe orthogonal to that, which is I think about data set as in like a comprehensible piece of or series of related pieces of information. And so I think about structured, unstructured, not in terms of how you're storing it, but that is just like a document that requires more or less sort of human interpretation to understand. So the difference between a table versus like a textual document, or a textual document with some markup that says something about the different parts of it, versus like a database, which is a series of related tables or whatever, as opposed to whether that's a JSON document or an HTML document or a Word document or an Excel file or a CSV or whatever. And I think maybe that has some impact on how you look at some of that bigger picture stuff that Pat was starting to talk about, especially in terms of this question about web pages versus like other kinds of stuff, which is sort of what I think about as the data set when you're talking about a web page isn't really like the content of the web page. It's the document that the web page represents. So while there is interesting other kinds of ways of looking at things, and I think about this in web monitoring where you look at like the navigation and the menus and the other stuff, when I think about the data set that's worth saving and thinking about and structuring when we talk about like a web page, I think more about like the content of that page and maybe how it might relate to other related documents. But I think about the document that page represents as opposed to the abstract computer software engineer perspective, the document that the HTML page is, which is like all the code. I'm thinking of the document, which is the main content of the page. And that also relates then to like, if a web page is really just like a table of information, so thinking again about web monitoring type stuff, there's plenty that are like, here's a list of like all these permits, and it's really just a giant table. The data set is that table. It's not the HTML or the markup or the anything else. And so I think it might be more useful, especially in the data together context, in my head at least, to think about that aspect of it and what data together or a group's role is in finding ways to find the canonical source of that data that somebody cares about and store it in the hopefully most structured way possible so that it requires the least special knowledge or interpretation to make use of.
It's so interesting. Oh, I'm supposed to.
Brendan. Oh, and then Mike.
Mike put his hand up. There we go.
Well, I just want to echo what Rob said about the difference between data and the format that it's stored in. So I guess I didn't think about it until he just mentioned it, but the notion that a table can be on a web page and it's still a table versus a table in a CSV file, and so it maybe matters less about how the data is acquired because it can have all these different formats, including a web page, HTML document, and maybe the distinction lies a little bit somewhere else. And I don't know what that somewhere else is, but the thing maybe to concentrate on is what's the information. And so you're looking to store data in whatever form it came in as, possibly translated into another form when it gets stored. And maybe some contextual information gets captured along with it. So like the whole page and all the text around on the page, even if there's just data just within a limited amount of that page. Particularly, cogent
Yeah, I think that's really, to me, that really resonates. It's like, because the closest metaphor I can think of is like the measurement of intelligence back when they developed the IQ test. And if you read some of the initial stuff, it was like The IQ test is intended to measure G, which is some abstract notion of human aptitude, right? Which is an immeasurable thing, versus the IQ, which was an intellectual quotient, which was this concrete thing that was being written down, but it was openly acknowledged to be imperfect. And so you have this notion of like the content, this abstract thing inside of, whether it be, it's the thing that the interpreter, the human, is trying to understand and apprehend, and the format that it's in is either more or less conducive to that interpretation in different forms. To me, what is really important to keep in mind there, though, is that that interpretation requirement is friction, right? And that to me is a really important sort of distinction. Just because content is inside of a web page is good, but for something to be useful, it needs to be accessible. And the harder it is to access something and work with something, the lower the chance that you'll actually use it, right? And so to me, it's like, it is really not a trivial matter that data is buried inside of a web page. Like that to me is really like heinous and wrong. And so I have all these like, I can wave my hands a lot around this topic, because I think that data friction and that lack of interoperability is what leads to so much challenge. But at the same time, and on the other hand, you really need some of that friction and interoperability, because it's what that actually is the specificity of the expression, right? Like a web page presents that content really clearly and cleanly in a browser, and that makes it interpretable and usable in that context. And what creates the problem is, as soon as you try to take it out of that context, put it in an archive, right? Now you have this whole new, like, now we have to come up with techniques for re-rendering it. And we have these questions about what are we going to do with this information now that we have an archive? Should we be undertaking the effort to sort of like put it into these interpretable forms, which requires us sort of injecting our own sort of interpretation onto that. And then that's where I think everything gets really messy really quickly, right? Did you keep these bits or did you lose these bits? Some people really care about the color of the title bar, and that really impacts the interpretation of, say, the terms of service, or that kind of stuff really matters in certain contexts. And in other contexts, like, look, I just want the text, I don't care, give me the table, right? So I think this is where we get like some of the sticky wickets, and to me that's exciting and worth talking about.
Anyone else? I'm really over the time now. These 30-minute roundtables are never like enough. I mean, so what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but from what you were saying, Rob, and then reiterated, I think, with some of what Brendan was just saying, is it feels like, and this may be a really obvious thing to say, but that there's a role that Data Together is playing in this kind of interpretive layer as well as this kind of access layer. Maybe they're one and the same. Just about, I don't know, I'm having a brain fart, but that there's I guess I want to kind of untease why we're talking about data and why we're talking about the difference between web archives and data as web archives, is thinking through the kind of challenges, as you were talking about, Brendan, about the, picking through data that's embedded in web pages and vice versa, and what's the role of Data Together or whoever layers are kind of sitting on top of it in terms of providing that access, and how does those different data types kind of determine those challenges in a lot of ways. I don't really, does anybody have any suggestions about going forward, what we might want to think more about? Maybe, yeah, I'm kind of aware this is quite a sort of, I don't know, information science-y conversation. Rob?
Sorry, I don't want to put myself too much in here if other people have things to say. I don't want to throw too much out because I feel like I'm not here in the Data Together group enough to have something super strong to say here, but like, especially when it comes to that question of like this stuff in the context of like web archives versus data sets and whatever Data Together is supposed to be doing. I kind of think of that sort of interpretive role in the middle of taking what is published publicly and trying to pack it back into a more like digestible data form as opposed to a document form, to use really rough terminology. is kind of the valuable role. Otherwise, we may as well just all be like working to help out Internet Archive do what they do better, or to just do a smaller, more targeted version of Internet Archive or whatever, which I think is a valuable thing also, but I don't think there's a whole lot new to be added there. Whereas I think a different and valuable role to have is to be able to make accessible and storable and shareable and blah, 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 the data that all these publicly accessible documents are trying to describe and talk about, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
and I
that
also,
was great. Ray?
thanks. I also think Rob's comment and then some other comments also make me think of then the role of data together as education, even for, quote unquote, like normal people, but then also people, doing archiving work too, because just from the experience of like hearing people talk about in the Ethics of Web Archiving conference, which I know I reference a lot, but I learned a ton in it. What people's ideas of what archiving means, like, is really broad. So people are like, is archiving my Twitter feed just taking screen grabs, like literally just like JPEGs of it, versus doing a save as to get the HTML, doing all these other things. There's this huge spectrum of what's considered archiving. And so, I think there's going to be an interesting part on trying to structure an understanding of what it means and what your purpose is. So maybe a screenshot of it is enough for some people, if they just have a memory of it. But if you're trying to do if it's for other purposes, then it will have, you're going to need to use other kinds of strategies. And so, I think the adjacent conversation is what our role in distinguishing these kinds of things as we sort of create our understanding of it, then how do we express that to other people?
There's lots of cool stuff in the chat. Yeah. And they're really big. Thanks, PatCon and Dawn. So having never done this before, we have 2 minutes left, and ideally, from what I've gathered from going to previous ones and Dawn's handily written notes, we're supposed to be coming up with kind of what we would like to see going forward, and maybe some to-dos here. But I definitely have a slew of notes on trying to kind of, tease together what we're saying. So maybe I'll come up with notes, and then we can, if you guys have further thoughts about where you might want to take this forward, we can comment on the roundtable issue, and we can maybe then follow up with a follow-up roundtable that in a couple months time. But I think there's some really interesting stuff here that really ties into sort of what we think the role of data together is, as usually these roundtables inevitably. So that's good. Hope everyone else feels good about that. I feel like I've talked a lot. Brendan?
I don't think you've talked a lot. I think you're doing great. I wanted to sort of quickly plug some of where I think I'd like to sort of see some of this go. In July, I'm hoping to get a bunch of people together to focus on what do web archives on the distributed web look like. Even if it's not establishing a spec, just at least getting some plans together on here's how we would coordinate a IPFS directory of work files so that they're more introspective, whatever. Lots of work to do there, but I want to get that going in July. And I really loved what PatCon was saying about how maybe this is a process-oriented thing as well. And I think what I'm super excited about from today is even in 20 minutes, this realization that maybe our actual job here is giving some of this structure, or to borrow some of the language I said earlier, but providing some frameworks for interpretation. And so if that's the case, then I'd really like to sort of invite everybody to, we'll get an issue going somewhere, a discussion going somewhere about how do we have a common foundation for interpreting web archives towards other things. If we can have a nice, clean, this is how we work with web archives and turn them into stuff, I think that would be a really exciting thing to both share and losing my train of thought, but also develop with the community. Because I think there's some issues of usability here that make it tough for communities to get access to web archives or find a meaningful way to work with them. And so if we can find ways that create tools that drive that, make it easier to sort of do that interplay between data set and web archive, I think that would be really valuable. But I don't know. That's where I'm hoping to take this. And so I'm going to be tapping a lot of you in the coming months to try and get this thing going in July. Yeah.
Awesome. Anybody have any thoughts? Otherwise, we're running over. Cool. It was nice to see everybody's faces again. It's a ginormous call. And we'll see you next time.